Chapter 3 of All the World by Charles Monroe Sheldon. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Recording by Adele de Pignerolles. Chapter 3 The front door bell rang, and Dr. Ward, quivering with rare excitement, stood up by his desk. For several years, indeed, from the beginning of his ministry in Bradford, he had established a custom of meeting any who had been touched by his preaching, or any who wished to see him on the religious life, in his little study in the parsonage after the Sunday evening service. He called this the open door. It had become as well known and established as any religious or social service of the church, and into the quiet of this little room, after the busy and sometimes exciting day, in the course of the years had come many perplexed and repentant souls, most of whom had gone out of the little room with happy tears on their faces and a song of deliverance in their hearts. Mrs. Ward had gone to the door, and there came in a group of young men. There were so many of them they filled the study up full. Dr. Ward was overcome, but he had only just begun to express his welcome when Bert Chandler said, speaking in his abrupt manner, "Dr. Ward, we know it's late, and we would have come earlier, but the chaplain came in at 9:30, and we hadn't seen him for 6 months and thought he was dead. We brought him along. He wanted to come when he found out what we were coming for. Chaplain Hunter, Dr. Ward." But Dick sprang forward and threw his arm about a man who had been the last to enter the room, crying out in a tone of delight, "Oh, chaplain, and you are alive!" "Very much so, Dick," said Chaplain Hunter, hugging him with both arms, and laughing and crying as Dr. Ward advanced through the group to meet him. "Hunter!" he said, fondly getting hold of one of the chaplain's hands. "Of course I know you. Welcome here, welcome. And to think he should be here to welcome, Dad. Why didn't you fellows tell me?" Dick turned to the group with a fiery gesture of arm and hand. Bert Chandler answered with his usual brevity. "We didn't know it ourselves until the chaplain walked in on us." "It's like a story out of Maupassant." "Or life," said Chaplain Hunter, his eye glistening as he glanced at his own boys of Company 241. "Tell us." "No, I came here to listen to a greater adventure than my own. Dr. Ward, I don't want to obtrude my little escapes and adventures since I went down on that last transport that was torpedoed in the Mediterranean. There's going to be plenty of time to tell it." "But, Dr. Ward, we haven't seen the chaplain since we heard of his death in Africa. It's like a miracle to see him here," said Underwood, who had been one of Dr. Ward's chorus before the war, as well as president of his Young People's Society, and an enthusiastic Sunday school teacher. "You ought to hear him tell about getting torpedoed. We never had any of that." And Underwood spoke with a tone of regret that sent the whole room into a roar. "Yes, give us that now," Dr. Ward said earnestly, bustling about, Dick and Bert helping to seat the visitors. "We have all the future before us for the thing that brought you here tonight. Give us your story, Hunter." Chaplain Willis Hunter, a man of 35, former pastor of the church in Bayview, next town to Bradford, glanced affectionately round the circle of his boys, and quietly began. "Dr. Ward, I can't tell you what a joy it is to me to be home again. I'd been in Bayview only a short time when the war broke out, and never had the pleasure of meeting you, but your son, Dick—" "Often mentioned you," said the doctor with a smile, the kind that radiated through the room. It seemed to him as if all of life in that little room thrilled with adventure, as indeed it did. "He saved my life. Dad, don't you remember I wrote—" "I have the floor," interrupted Hunter, blushing through his tan as if he were a girl. "Let me get this torpedoing off my mind, and then we'll get at the real business of the evening; for I feel, sir, after what the boys have told me of your sermon this morning, that we are on the eve of one of the greatest adventures this country or the world will ever know. Just a word. I went out with the first bunch of chaplains that sailed in 1917, got in touch with Company 241 in France, and was on my way 6 months ago to Syria with a transport containing YMCA secretaries, missionaries, and chaplains to assist in the Palestine relief. We were near the end of our trip through the Mediterranean. Saturday night I went to bed about midnight after an evening on deck that was one of the most beautiful I ever saw on the water. The moon was full, the ocean like a sea of glass. It was to be our last night on the boat, and somehow almost every one seemed to think the danger was over. We were in plain sight of a lighthouse flashing on the coast, and its welcome, or something, instilled a false sense of security. The only precaution I took was to sleep fully dressed except for shoes, coat, and hat. On the way over I heard the commander growling away to the effect that the ship stood no show anyway, for she had 13 ministers aboard. Apparently the hoodoo worked, for I had been asleep less than an hour when the first torpedo struck. There was no loud explosion, just a dull, heavy thud that shook the boat from stem to stern. No one needed to tell us what had happened. When you ask me what I did, my answer is, I grabbed my family pictures and ran. As a matter of fact, there is little more to the programme than that. I switched on the light, awoke my room mate, jumped into my tall boots, without lacing, pulled on sweater, coat, overcoat, life preserver, and hat, grabbed the articles mentioned, and ran as aforesaid. Needless to say, nerves were a trifle taut, and a bit of humour which flashed across my mind tearing up the back stairway 60 miles a minute helped a lot to save the situation. I happened to think that I might stumble on those flopping shoelaces, and the answering thought was, "It will have to be a lively shoelace to get ahead of these boots for the next minute or two." The lifeboat was in the water 4 minutes after the explosion, with the stern of the steamer already half under. We were the first boat away on our side, and I think the first of either side. The steamer disappeared in just 13 minutes after the first explosion. I shall certainly never forget that sight. She settled stern first, the prow finally coming entirely out of the water and silhouetted against the full moon. Finally, as the water reached the boiler, there came a terrific explosion which broke her in the middle, and she sank like a shot. Conditions couldn't have been better, because it was as light a day and perfectly calm. We were in the boats only about 20 minutes when we disembarked on the deck of an English destroyer. They said she was an old type boat, but old or new, believe me, she was the best looking boat I ever saw. The most impressive moment I ever had was when he lined up on deck and our leader called the roll. We were pretty sure everyone was there, but not positive, and when the last man answered, "Here," the crowd cheered their heads off, and we responded standing at attention and sang the doxology, and God Save the King. I saved one complete outfit of clothing, overcoat, hat, gloves, my old grey sweater, both family pictures, camera, and razor. Everything else was lost, but somehow or other things didn't seem to amount to much after I once got my feet on the land. And that's all, only somehow the report got out that I was lost, with a number of others, and my unit was switched from Beirut to Cape Town on the new Zulu mission work so suddenly that no word of my being all right ever reached the boys in France, and I thought I could give them a little surprise on my way to Bayview from New York. And here I am, thankful to the good God, after plenty of adventures in Africa that can wait, for I want to know of the new adventure we are going into. And Chaplain Hunter looked around the circle of earnest faces with a gleam in his eye that reminded Dick of the look he gave him when he went out that night into No Man's Land and brought him in safely back to the company. A silence fell over the circle. It had listened in tense mood when the chaplain was relating his adventure, but now the object of their visit to the open door seemed to come at once into prominence. This group of young men had lived in the atmosphere of exciting and changing events so long and continuously that everyone present had come home with the thought of being a part of the commonplaces of Bradford and its daily routine, getting into business, marrying, having a home, and settling down. But Dr. Ward's sermon had stirred them like another call to the colours. How was the world to be saved after all without saviours? And the heroic note had been struck in his sermon with a power that the preacher did not know himself. He looked around the group now and was almost astonished at the sight of those present. He had known these boys in his parish since they were little fellows in the Sunday school. Now here they were, tanned, muscular, serious-eyed, ready to grapple with big things, feeling the stir of life, eager for its struggle. Almost before a question had been asked, the room seemed to be electric with prayer. They had all kneeled when Dr. Ward went to his knees. His prayer was an outpouring for wisdom, guidance, strength, revealing, power. The chaplain followed, and in his first sentence Dr. Ward understood something of the secret of the chaplain's influence over his boys. He said, "Father of us all, we are not only in the hollow of thy hand, but in the bend of thine arm." And then with beseeching power he seemed to break open the very gates of the other world, and reveal the greatness of the common purpose that had brought them into that little room to consult together. The boys all offered short prayers, simple, direct, personal, a revelation to Dr. Ward of spiritual feeling. And it was noticeable in all this there was no straining for effect, no praying to others, but each voice seemed to be a personal, direct appeal for individual wisdom and strength. Dr. Ward was wise in his counsel. "We have not come, I am sure, to propose any definite fixed plan tonight. I understand the main purpose of every one of you is to enter upon the great adventure of world conquest in obedience to the Master's command to go into all the world. That determination is so serious, so vital, so full of meaning to you all, that I am sure we shall have to meet many times and plan very deeply and carefully if we carry out the command as the Master wishes." They were all so greatly interested that they remained in conference until after midnight. The chaplain's face glowed with enthusiasm. As the group finally went out, The chaplain's last word to Dr. Ward lingered in every heart. "Dr. Ward, we have just come out of a great world adventure, but I believe we are now proposing to go into another so much greater that no man can measure its dynamic or weigh its dimensions." When the doctor had shut the door and had come back into his study, Dick was still there, standing by his father's desk. And it was at that moment that Dr. Ward thought of one question he had been several times on the point of asking his son when he first came to him that evening after declaring his purpose. He put the question now with the usual characteristic family frankness. "Dick, lad, how about Requa? Have you thought of her? Will she go with you into all the world?" Dick turned at the question and disclosed a startled look at his father. It was several moments before he answered. Then he answered slowly, "Father, I had forgotten Requa." Dick repeated the words as he stood there. "I never thought of Requa," and then answered, "But I'll have to think of her now. Her father will never let her go." "How do you know he won't?" "She said so." "But Randall will not oppose her going if her happiness is in question." "But suppose it's a knowledge of his happiness?" Dick asked, with more shrewd knowledge of Requa's father than Dr. Ward supposed he possessed. "I don't know, lad. You will have to go and see him." Dick had started to go out of the study. He stopped at the door, and said slowly, "Dad, do you know, I'm afraid of Requa's father. I never was afraid of the Germans, and I know you don't believe I'm a coward, but I would rather go over the ridge at Chateau Thierry any time than face him and ask him to do a thing I know he doesn't want to do." Dr. Ward laughed. "Is it as bad as all that? Go too, my son. Does Requa belong to him more than to you?" "She belongs to me. We belong to each other," said Dick doggedly. "But all the same I'm afraid. How could I forget Requa? How could I?" He went up to his room asking the question, and in addition to it the other, the one he dreaded to ask. What was Requa's father say? He smiled grimly to himself as he sat there in the dark, for he had not turned on his light, wondering what Requa's father would say, how he would act, what Requa would do if her father refused to give his consent. And the longer he thought of it, the more he feared the outcome. Chapter 4